And my presentation is on shallow water blackouts, and the reason why I've chosen this topic, actually the two reasons, are first of all, it's a topic that is not as known as it should be, especially here in Ireland, and there is a little bit more awareness in America, UK, and in Australia, but in Ireland it's not as known as it should be. And the other reason is when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to present at this conference, I came across a presentation given by Bob Bowman, who's Michael Phelps' coach, and he was giving this presentation telling basically the story of how a swimmer in their club, the Baltimore Aquatics Swimming Club, died by shallow water blackout. And that prompted me to give this presentation. And I've chosen this slide because this fish is a beautiful fish, and obviously no one would doubt that it's a good swimmer, but it's a fish that can actually drown. So if anybody is interested in fish keeping or having a discussion about fish that can drown, we can have that afterwards. But that is just to highlight the fact that most of the time are good swimmers and probably the best swimmers who die because of shallow water blackouts. But what is it, shallow water blackout? Basically, it's when a swimmer faints under the water. And that is due to a lack of oxygen to the brain. So the natural defense of the body triggers the fainting to protect the brain. And it's triggered this by repeatedly going underwater and holding the breath. So breath-holding activities and repeating them and for too long can trigger this shallow water blackout. Without immediate rescue, the swimmer drowns, and it's a very quickly, that is happening very, very quickly, and we'll see why. The problem with shallow water blackouts, as I said at the beginning, is that the number of deaths is not really well known. So we don't know actually how many people are dying every year from shallow water blackouts. And the reason for that is a lot of the time these deaths are mistaken for drownings, traditional drownings, okay? And most of the time there is no witness to say, oh no, that was a shallow water blackout. It happens in the backyard pools and things like that. According to Swimming Canada, up to the 20% of all the drowning worldwide is actually due to shallow water blackouts. And probably it's the leading cause of drowning for competitive or accomplished swimmers. To complicate things even more, there can be other causes besides drowning to the death of the person blacking out under the water. But how does it happen? The major contributing factor to shallow water blackouts is hyperventilation. So hyperventilation lowers the level of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, okay, and in our organs. Can be either voluntary and involuntary, and we're going to talk about this later. But hyperventilation lowers our level of CO2 in the bloodstream. And the CO2 is the trigger that gives us the urge to breathe under the water. So when you are submerged, what is giving you that urge to breathe is not the lack of oxygen. You still have plenty of oxygen in your body. It's the buildup of CO2. But now, when you are under the water, obviously you are using that oxygen, and the oxygen is getting depleted. But if you have been hyperventilating beforehand, okay, you have lowered the level of CO2, and therefore that trigger starts much later, and it might be too late the moment that trigger kicks in. So if it's too late, the swimmer gets unconscious because of the lack of oxygen to the brain. And to make things even more dangerous, there's a body reaction after a few seconds of the swimmer passing out. There is a reaction, natural reaction, that forces a deep breath. And that makes the lungs fill in with water. That creates a lot of issues, even in terms of rescue, because that makes the resuscitation even more complicated. And as I said initially, without immediate rescue, the swimmer drowns and dies quite quickly, probably because of the brain being starved already of oxygen. And I have here, I know, try to explain this more clearly for whoever is a visual learner. Here we have a normal dive, a normal situation when someone is breathing normally, then goes under the water, and you have in red here the oxygen levels, and here the blue line is the CO2 or carbon dioxide level. As we are under the water, as you can see, we start using oxygen. The oxygen is being used up, and the CO2 is going up, and reaches here the trigger point. At that point, you have the urge to breathe, and therefore you reemerge and you take your breath. And even if the oxygen was going down, then it goes back up and never reaches the blackout zone. It never reaches the zone when you would faint. But what is happening with a shallow water blackout dive that is normally a dive done doing hyperventilation beforehand, okay? What it's doing hyperventilation is dropping the level of CO2 in your bloodstream. It's actually not possible to increase the level of oxygen. So it's just an illusion. It's just giving you the sensation that you can stay under the water longer because it's delaying that urge to breathe. But in fact, what it's doing is just reducing the level of CO2, hyperventilation. So what is happening is that as you dive in, you start using oxygen, and yes, the level of CO2 goes up, but it's still too low to trigger the breath and that urge to breathe. And what might happen is that you reach a dangerously low level of oxygen before you actually feel the need to breathe. And that's when the swimmer is passing out. And why is it so dangerous? It's very, very dangerous because there are no warning signs. Most of the time, the swimmer doesn't know that he's going to or she is going to pass out. There are no warning signs. And then, on top of that, as I said, after passing out, there is a deep breath being taken within probably 10, 12 seconds that fills the lungs. And that's why death, well, brain damage first and then death occur much quicker than in normal drowning, because the body has already, and the brain, have already been starved of oxygen. So that is reducing the amount of time needed for the death to occur. They reckon that the critical time is between 2 minutes and 2 minutes and a half, whilst with a traditional drowning it takes much longer, as you know. The other danger is that it's very difficult to spot for lifeguards. It's something that is happening under the water. And most of the time are the best swimmers, accomplished swimmers. The guy in the Baltimore aquatic swimming team, his name was Louis Lowenthal. He had just finished, he was a very good age grouper swimmer. He had just finished his training session, and he stayed a little bit longer to practice some underwater kicking. And he stayed during the public hours, and the lifeguards were on patrol. But they didn't pay any notice because they knew him. He was a very good swimmer, an accomplished swimmer. He was just doing some extra practice. Why should I be watching him? And he was a member of the public who told them that Lewis was at the bottom of the pool unconscious. And what happened was they reckon he stayed in the water no longer than 2 minutes, but he was 2 minutes too late. And when he was rescued, he was still alive. They tried resuscitation, but because of the mechanism that I explained, he had he had water in his lungs, and had to go to hospital, obviously, and he died later on in hospital. As I said, the brain damage occurs quite quickly for the reasons we mentioned. Now, there are different conditions that can trigger a shallow water blackout. I described the most common and the one that is probably the most known. And it's the most common, as I said, is the one that is hyperventilation beforehand. Hyperventilation lowers the CO2 levels, and then the trigger is coming too late, and the swimmer gets unconscious. Just to talk about hyperventilation a little bit more, that can be intentional, and it's what free divers do normally to get ready for the dive under the water, but can also be involuntary. And that can be a case of having done an exercise that had brought the body to some sort of stress situation or exertion. That could be a set in training, could be especially a set that is pushing the swimmer to the maximum aerobic capacity. There is another condition that could be slightly different, and it's when the level of oxygen prior to the breath holding is actually quite low. So it's not a problem this time, the CO2. This time the problem is the oxygen being quite low because of the type of activity done beforehand. So could be a number of laps under the water, repeating the underwater breath holding activity a number of times, and until you reach a point when the level of oxygen is too low anyway. Or can be, again, a type of exercise that has brought the swimmer to exertion and exhaustion. And in this case, it's quite intuitive. The blackout occurs when the level of oxygen is too low in the body. And again, it's before the CO2 level, the critical level to trigger the breath, is reached. And there is a third condition, that it's when the level of oxygen and the level of CO2 are actually normal beforehand. But as the trigger kicks in, the swimmer or the diver voluntarily and intentionally ignores the danger. A lot of free divers have learned how to control and that feel and that urge to breathe. Okay, and so they control, they can push it to the limit, and sometimes in a competition situation, in a competitive environment, they tend to focus so much that they keep on pushing the limit. The danger here is that after a while, that urge to breathe actually subsides. And some sort of euphoria and sense of empowerment kicks in. It's like if they were on a high and feeling a little bit drunk, okay? So they cannot feel the danger, they feel safe and they feel actually great, but then the reality is they are in that state because the oxygen is already getting to a very dangerous low level. And as the oxygen goes even lower, they faint. And again, we have the same situation as described before. There are other considerations that complicate a little bit more the equation, and the fact that sometimes these deaths are not recognized for what they are. And I think this is especially important here in Ireland, because whoever gets involved in competitive sports doesn't have to undertake a regular medical check, as it happens in other countries. So breath holding activities can actually trigger some genetic or underlying conditions. For a number of reasons, and there are some research in this respect, but they can trigger a fatal cardiac attack under the water, can lead to seizures, and also there are situations when actually there is a spasm of the larynx and the swimmer dies from asphyxiation, not from drowning. So all these things make things a little bit more complicated. And we have a problem in terms of accepting this culture of breath holding in our culture, because this has been done for decades, has been done for a long time, and people don't see anything wrong with it. And to some extent can be done. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done at all. But the problem is coaches and military trainers still teach hypoxic training and breath holding activities. These activities can be deadly, as we have seen, without any professional and one-to-one monitoring. Can be done, but you need to have a one-to-one monitoring when you do these things. I've seen some scary videos from the US Navy SEALs, okay, where people are pushed to the limit and to the point of passing out. A couple of years ago, if I remember well, 2 of them died from shallow water blackouts because they were trying to reach the target to pass their course, and they were practicing by themselves, and they pushed themselves to the limit, and there was nobody there to rescue them. There was no professional support there, and they both passed out, and they both died. Unfortunately, lifeguards don't have the training, most of the time don't have the training to deal with these incidents and to prevent these kind of incidents. I deliver courses for people who want to become swimming teachers and swimming coaches, and quite often I have people who are already qualified lifeguards on my courses, and I'm amazed that a lot of them don't know anything about shallow water blackouts. They know absolutely nothing about them. Some of them might have heard something, but they don't know exactly what the mechanism is. So that is one of the problems, that lifeguards don't have the training, and most of the time they are not in the conditions to monitor one-to-one that activity. So how can we avoid shallow water blackouts? What should we do to avoid this? The first and most important is never, ever hyperventilate before a dive. That is really, really important. Never ignore the urge to breathe. If you have that urge to breathe, there is a reason for that. Never swim alone. Never play breath-holding games, because, again, you can get into that competition mode and get into a danger zone. And no repetitive underwater laps. So you can do one lap and then take your breath, and then you have to do something else. It's very, very dangerous when you start doing one after another and then another and trying to push even further. And my suggestion and advice to whoever is involved in swimming coaching is, if you want to do any form of breath-holding activity, do it at the beginning of the session, not at the end where they are exhausted and you might have some of the conditions that we have just seen. And I'd like to finish just with some references. So these are some of the websites where you can get some information. And there's also an article from Aquatics International. And that's it from me. Thank you for